He humiliated her in front of the whole class, convinced she couldn't even understand the equation. But as soon as she picked up the chalk, everything froze. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. At Jefferson Preparatory Academy, everything had its place. The windows were always polished to a shine so brilliant they mirrored the ambition of the students. The grass on the quad was trimmed every Friday at precisely 6 a.m., and the bell chimed not just on time, but with a crispness that echoed authority. The school prided itself on excellence, discipline, and tradition. Its hallways were adorned with portraits of distinguished alumni, judges, senators, CEOs, nearly all of them white, nearly all of them men. It was a school that spoke in legacy and walked in quiet entitlement. The faculty mirrored the tone. They were composed, calculating, and carried themselves with the confidence of people who had never known what it was like to be looked past. Among them, Mr. Richard Hadley was a fixture. Mid-50s, sharply dressed, hair silver at the temples in the way that made people call him distinguished, and with a presence that silenced rooms the moment he entered. He taught AP Calculus and linear algebra, and students spoke his name with both awe and fear. His was a voice that could freeze a student mid-sentence with a single syllable, his sarcasm wrapped in eloquence sharp enough to leave paper cuts. Mr. Hadley believed in standards. He believed intelligence could be measured, graded, and ranked. He believed intellect was a natural hierarchy, and those at the top had earned their place by sheer ability. And though he would never say it out loud, no, he wasn't a fool, he believed, with the quiet certainty of a man who had never been challenged, that brilliance was a trait most often inherited by those who looked like him. Each morning before class, Hadley would arrive 15 minutes early, unlocking his room and setting out the day's problems in neat white chalk across the blackboard. His equations were elegant, his notation flawless. The room would fill with the low buzz of eager voices, and when he stepped to the front of the class, silence fell like a curtain. It was in that silence that Hadley felt most alive, and in that silence walked a woman no one noticed. Her name was Mabel Jenkins. She arrived earlier than Hadley, always had. She moved through the halls with a mop and cart before dawn, her steps slow but steady, her presence subdued. She was a woman who had mastered invisibility, and not by choice. Gray coils of hair were always wrapped in a neatly tied cloth. Her brown uniform faded from years of scrubbing floors and wiping away the stains others left behind. Her hands were strong, calloused, worn from decades of labor that no one cared to acknowledge. To most at Jefferson Prep, she was simply the janitor. If students saw her at all, they saw the cart, the mop, the rags. If teachers spoke to her, it was to say she'd missed a spot, or to hurry her out of a classroom before a lecture began. Hadley, for his part, barely saw her. He registered her movements like one would register the changing of the seasons, distant, background, necessary, but irrelevant. She did not exist in his intellectual landscape. She was not a student, nor a scholar. She was part of the building, like the floors she scrubbed. But Mabel Jenkins noticed everything. She noticed how student shoulders tensed as Hadley approached. She noticed how he called on boys more than girls, and how his compliments were always reserved for students who mirrored his own upbringing. She noticed how his eyes glazed over when the two black girls in his class raised their hands. She saw how the teachers laughed just a bit louder at his jokes in the lounge. She swept their discarded coffee cups, wiped away the ink that bled from their red pens, and absorbed every echo of their arrogance. She never said a word, not when a sophomore knocked over his soda and laughed as she knelt to clean it, Not when a substitute teacher dropped her folder and huffed as if it were Mabel's fault. Not when Hadley himself walked past her in the hallway discussing a formula with a colleague and gestured directly through her as if she weren't there. She never flinched, never broke stride. Mabel had learned long ago that dignity was not something anyone gave you. It was something you kept for yourself, quietly, fiercely, especially when no one was looking. In the quiet mornings, when no students had arrived, she would linger near the blackboards, reading the equations Hadley had written. The numbers, the symbols, the logic, none of it was foreign. Her eyes would follow the line of derivations, and she would tilt her head ever so slightly when she spotted a shortcut he hadn't taken. But she never touched the chalk. There was a time, long ago, when Mabel had touched chalk every day. When she'd stood at the front of a room filled with questions and had all the answers. But that was another life. One tucked so deep behind years of unspoken memories that even she rarely let herself remember it. Jefferson Prep did not know that version of her. They knew only the woman who emptied their trash bins and polished their floors until they gleamed. One morning, as she pushed her cart down the corridor toward room 214, Hadley's classroom, she paused. The door was already open. Hadley's voice echoed from within, sharp and animated. He was speaking to a student, something about precision and proof. Mabel stood for a moment just outside the door, not eavesdropping, simply existing. She watched the student nod with a mixture of fear and awe. She saw Hadley's hand move to underline a portion of the equation already drawn on the board, his movements precise, theatrical. Then, without a glance in her direction, he said, "Try not to make the floor sticky this time, will you?" The student laughed. Mabel said nothing. She entered quietly, mop in hand, and began her work in the far corner of the room. Hadley didn't look at her again. He continued his lecture as if the remark had never been made. To him, she was no more than background noise. But that would change. In the weeks that followed, the temperature in the city dropped. Students returned from Thanksgiving break brimming with exhaustion. Hadley, never one to ease up, decided it was time to challenge them with a problem he claimed came from an Ivy League admissions exam. It spanned 3 blackboards, layered in functions, nested variables, and a twist at the end designed to trip up even the brightest student. He called it the gauntlet. They groaned. He grinned. For 5 days, no one solved it. By Friday, the class buzzed with tension. Students whispered in pairs, passing around failed attempts scribbled on notepads. Hadley stood by the window, smug, the way he always did when he believed he had asserted dominance. And then the door creaked open. Mabel Jenkins stepped inside, mop and cart in tow, as she had done every Friday morning for 15 years. The moment would pass without note. Hadley's voice would fill the room. The chalk would point toward the unsolved problem, and something, small but irreversible, would begin to shift. Because everything has its place, until someone dares to step outside the box drawn for them. And Mabel Jenkins was no longer content to remain invisible. The room was unusually quiet that Friday morning. The air was heavy with frustration, and the tension that had been building all week hung like a storm cloud about to break. The chalkboard stretched from one end of the front wall to the other, dominated by the sprawl of an equation that looked more like a battle plan than a mathematical expression. Students sat hunched over their desks, scribbling notes, flipping through pages of textbooks, whispering in low voices to one another. The so-called gauntlet had become a symbol of shared defeat, a monument to Hadley's belief that some challenges were simply beyond reach for most. Hadley, however, was enjoying himself. He prowled the front of the room like a lion in the savannah, lips curled in a faint smirk, watching his students fail over and over again. It wasn't the first time he had used an unsolvable or nearly unsolvable problem to assert his authority, but this one was special. This one had teeth. 5 days had passed, and not a single student had come close to unraveling it. As the clock ticked toward the hour, a few students dared to approach the board, attempting to show their partial work, only to be coolly dismissed. Hadley took pleasure in dismantling each effort. "You've mistaken the inverse for the reciprocal," he said at one point, waving his hand through the air as if brushing away the attempt like dust. "Start again. If you don't understand the foundation, you'll never survive the structure." The students weren't surprised by his demeanor. They had long since accepted it as part of the experience of being in his class. He wasn't known for encouragement, and he certainly wasn't known for patience. But what he lacked in warmth, he made up for in sharpness, intellectually and verbally. A backhanded compliment from Hadley was more valuable than outright praise from any other teacher in the school. The door creaked open. No one looked up. The sound was familiar, part of the rhythm of the school day. The wheels of a mop bucket followed, accompanied by the soft shuffling of worn soles on linoleum. Mabel Jenkins entered the room with the same quiet diligence that marked her every appearance. Her head was slightly bowed, her hands already gripping the mop handle with the practiced ease of someone who had performed the motion 1,000 times. Hadley glanced over his shoulder, barely registering her presence. To him, she was as much a part of the classroom's ecosystem as the fluorescent lights overhead, or the chalk dust on the ledges, unseen, unnoticed, unremarkable. He turned back to the class with renewed vigor. "And here we are," he said, motioning dramatically to the equation. "The beast still stands undefeated. A week of attempts, and yet not one of you has come close to cracking it." He paused, then turned back toward the mop bucket. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and the corner of his mouth twitched. He saw an opportunity, not for insight, but for performance. "Might be time for some unconventional thinking," he said, his voice rising just enough to carry across the room. "Perhaps we've been approaching this the wrong way. Maybe what we need is a fresh perspective." Several students looked up, confused. Hadley gestured toward Mabel. "What do you think, Miss Jenkins?" he said with a theatrical lilt. "Care to take a crack at it?" The words hit the room like a dropped plate. For a moment, there was silence. Not the respectful kind, but the kind that precedes a collective snicker. A few students exchanged glances. One of them, seated near the back, stifled a laugh. Another raised an eyebrow, unsure whether the question was serious. Hadley stood with arms folded, radiating smugness. He had no expectation that she would respond, let alone approach the board. That wasn't the point. It was, of course, a joke. A cruel, deliberate joke, and it worked. Laughter broke out in bursts, some restrained, others openly mocking. One boy leaned toward his friend and muttered something about the math wizard with the mop. Another said, just loudly enough to be heard, "Maybe she'll clean the board instead." Hadley didn't stop them. He didn't need to. His tone had given them permission. Mabel did not look at him. She did not flinch. She continued mopping in the corner of the room as if nothing had been said. Her movements were steady, her gaze fixed on the floor, the gentle swoosh of the mop the only sound she offered in response. But inside, something stirred. She had heard worse in her life, far worse. The world had taught her many lessons, and humiliation was not a new language to her. She had endured years of backhanded comments, of teachers who ignored her, of professors who questioned how she had gotten into their programs in the first place. She had smiled through job interviews where her degrees were scrutinized more than her skills. She had stood in grocery store lines while people pretended not to see her. And she had taken this job not because she lacked ability, but because the world had told her, again and again, that there was no place for a woman like her at the front of the classroom. But there, in that moment, with the laughter echoing around her and a mop in her hand, she felt something break loose. Not a scream, not a cry, but a stillness, a resolve, a breath drawn from the deepest part of her memory. She set the mop back into the bucket with a quiet click. The room didn't notice. Hadley had already turned back to the class, satisfied with his performance. "We can't all be mathematicians," he said, his voice thick with irony. "But it's nice to know everyone gets a moment at the chalkboard." More laughter. Mabel walked toward the front of the room. At first, no one paid attention. The students were too busy whispering among themselves, still riding the aftershocks of the joke. It wasn't until she reached the chalkboard, lifted the piece of chalk with her left hand, and paused that the room began to shift. The silence came slowly, like a curtain being drawn. One by one, heads turned. Hadley turned too, expecting her to be wiping the board, but she wasn't holding an eraser. She was holding the chalk. She was studying the equation, really studying it. Her brow furrowed slightly, her lips pressed together, and then she began to write. The first few strokes were cautious, almost hesitant, like someone reacquainting themselves with an old language. But then her hand found its rhythm, and the chalk began to move with speed and purpose. The sounds of scratching and sliding filled the room, echoing in the stunned quiet. The students watched, first in confusion, then with dawning recognition. She wasn't copying what was already there. She was rewriting, restructuring. She was simplifying where others had complicated, correcting false assumptions, identifying shortcuts they hadn't seen. She moved with the grace of someone who didn't need to think twice, who had already solved the problem in her head before she put chalk to board. Hadley stared, arms no longer crossed, his smirk frozen. The line of equations lengthened. She didn't stop. She filled the first board, then moved to the second. When a piece of chalk broke, she picked up another without pause. Her breathing was even, her posture straight. The class was no longer laughing. By the time she reached the third board, even the students in the back had risen from their chairs to see. No one spoke. Not even Hadley. When she finally stepped away from the board, the entire equation stood transformed. Solved, not just correctly, but elegantly, beautifully. The kind of solution that made you understand why people fell in love with math in the first place. She turned around. Her eyes swept the room once, landing on Hadley last. He looked back at her, speechless. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She picked up her mop and walked out of the room. Behind her, the silence roared. Long after Mabel had disappeared down the hallway, the classroom remained unnervingly still. No one reached for their notebooks. No one whispered. The chalkboard, once an emblem of intellectual challenge and superiority, now stood like a monument to something far greater, something none of them had anticipated. The white symbols, scrawled in clean, logical sequence across all three panels, glowed beneath the sterile classroom lights. It was more than just a solution. It was an act of quiet defiance, of impossible grace. It had upended the laws that ruled not just mathematics, but the invisible codes by which the school operated. Mr. Hadley remained frozen near his desk. He stared at the board as though it were a hallucination. his expression locked somewhere between disbelief and dawning shame. For once, he had nothing to say. The words, the tools he wielded like knives, had fled from him. There were no witticisms sharp enough to cut through what had just happened, no sarcastic deflections strong enough to reassert control over the room. In the back of the class, a student finally spoke in a whisper, barely audible. Did she really just solve that? The question floated in the air like incense, fragrant with disbelief. Heads turned, eyes wide, still blinking in an effort to process what they had witnessed. The silence began to break, not with laughter or noise, but with awe. It was a slow unraveling, students whispering to each other, murmuring theories, revisiting the problem mentally as though they had missed something essential, something no textbook had ever taught them. She didn't even hesitate, another student said. It's like she just knew, like she'd done it before. A few students began gathering near the chalkboard, peering at the solution with newfound reverence. Their fingertips hovered inches from the chalk marks, as if afraid that in touching them would undo the magic. The elegant notations had an artistry to them, loops that were precise, slashes that were confident, steps laid out in a perfect cascade of logic. It wasn't just correct, it was beautiful. A solution composed by someone who not only understood the problem, but loved the language in which it was written. Hadley took a slow step forward. He scanned the three boards, eyes moving from one segment to the next, verifying the work almost unwillingly. Each line was sound, each assumption valid, every transformation justified. There were no flaws, no shortcuts taken out of ignorance, no oversights to exploit. It was, by every measurable standard, the most precise solution he had seen in years, perhaps in his entire career. A pressure began to grow behind his eyes, dull and insistent. He felt a sensation unfamiliar to him in that room, in that role, standing at the front as the unchallenged authority. It was vulnerability. It was the shame of having misjudged, misread, underestimated, not just a person, but a human being whose worth he had dismissed with a smirk and a cruel joke. The classroom door was still ajar, but Mabel was gone. There was no applause, no announcement, no vindication spoken aloud, and yet the silence she left behind was louder than any ovation. One of the students, a quiet girl named Sarah, who rarely spoke, finally turned to Hadley. Her voice, though soft, held an edge. "Who is she?" Hadley didn't answer. He couldn't. Not because he didn't know, but because he suddenly realized just how little he'd ever cared to find out. The bell rang, but no one moved. It tolled like a distant church bell at a funeral, slow, surreal, out of place in the stunned stillness of the classroom. The sound was meant to signal movement, to end one period and usher in another, but the students remained rooted in place. No one reached for backpacks. No one filed toward the door. It was as if the moment had suspended time, fractured the normal flow of the day, and left them stranded in the wake of something sacred and unsettling. Eventually, students began to trickle out, subdued and contemplative. A few lingered by the board, taking pictures on their phones as if to capture proof, to ensure that it hadn't all been a collective illusion. They didn't laugh. They didn't joke. They didn't ask Hadley to explain the solution. They knew he couldn't. When the last student left, Hadley remained alone in the room. He looked again at the board. His fingers twitched at his side, as if considering picking up a piece of chalk to reclaim his territory, to assert his role as the master of the classroom. But his hand fell limp. He turned to the window instead, staring at the frost-lined trees just outside, their branches unmoved in the still morning air. In the teacher's lounge later that day, word had already begun to spread. It began with fragments. Disconnected murmurs passed between lockers and hallways, whispered at lunch tables, scribbled into texts. "Did you hear what happened in Hadley's class? No joke. She solved the gauntlet. The janitor. I swear, I watched it. She just walked up and did it, like it was nothing." By fifth period, the story had taken root, growing like a vine through the school's social strata. Each retelling carried more awe, more reverence, and more questions. Students started asking who Mabel Jenkins was, not just in passing, but with urgency. They wanted to know what she had studied, where she had come from, what her story was. For the first time, her name was being spoken not with condescension, but with genuine curiosity. Hadley kept to himself. He spoke even less than usual, his clipped sarcasm replaced by something harder to define. The students noticed the change. He no longer prowled the front of the room. He sat more often, letting discussions unfold without interruption. He didn't assign another gauntlet. In fact, he rarely mentioned the previous one again. The only visible reminder of that day was the board. He had left the equation untouched. For 3 days, it remained as she had written it, untouched by eraser or revision. He claimed it was for educational purposes, a model of excellence. But the students knew the truth. He didn't touch it because he couldn't improve it. It stood there like a silent rebuke, a testament to a brilliance that had existed under his nose for years. In the quiet of those days, something began to shift not just in the classroom, but in the hearts of the students themselves. They had witnessed something that disrupted their sense of order, their understanding of where knowledge came from and who was allowed to possess it. They began to reconsider their assumptions, not just about Mabel, but about everyone they had ignored or written off. Some students began to nod respectfully when they saw her in the halls. Others made quiet efforts to greet her, to hold open doors, to acknowledge her presence with something close to humility. Mabel, for her part, remained unchanged. She moved through the school as she always had, mop in hand, cloth tucked neatly into her apron. She didn't alter her pace, didn't respond to the stares or whispers. If she noticed the change in behavior, she gave no sign. But something inside her had shifted too. She had not planned to solve the problem. She hadn't even meant to look at the board. But in that moment, surrounded by laughter and mockery, something within her had stepped forward. It wasn't pride. It wasn't revenge. It was necessity. A need to reclaim herself, to reassert her dignity in a space where it had been dismissed. She had nothing to prove, but she had proved it nonetheless. In the quiet corners of the school, some students began to search her name online. They found nothing at first, just mentions in the staff directories, references to maintenance schedules. But one enterprising senior, intrigued beyond containment, decided to dig deeper. He found a faded photograph in a university archive. M.L. Jenkins, presenter at a mathematics symposium in 1973. The paper she had co-authored was titled "On the Topology of Closed Operator Sets in Hilbert Space." No one in the school understood what it meant, but they understood the name. The story continued to spread, gaining momentum. She used to be a mathematician. No, like, seriously, a real one, professor level. Why would she be working here? No one had an answer. They only had more questions. And in those questions a new silence began to grow. One not of ignorance or arrogance, but of reflection. The kind that comes when a truth too long buried finally begins to rise. The weekend came and went like a quiet breath. By Monday morning, Jefferson Preparatory Academy was still buzzing, though the energy had shifted. The usual morning chatter in the hallways had been replaced by a low, murmuring curiosity, as if the entire school had become a single whispering voice trying to make sense of something too large to name. The event in Hadley's classroom had settled deep into the bones of the building, not like a scandal, but like a legend just beginning to take root. And in the center of it, invisible as always, was Mabel Jenkins. She moved through the corridors the same way she always had, pushing her cart, her mop handle upright like a staff, her footsteps soft but deliberate. The halls parted for her now in strange new ways. Students stepped aside. Teachers, though few acknowledged her directly, did not block her path or hurry her along with impatient glances. The laughter that had once echoed behind her back was gone, replaced with a silence that was no longer dismissive but observant. She felt it, but gave no sign. In truth, Mabel had been expecting the moment to pass. These people, these students, these faculty members, had spent years not seeing her. One moment, however brilliant, would not undo a lifetime of invisibility. She had grown used to the rhythm of disregard and the quiet power of her own perseverance. But this time, something was different. They hadn't looked away. They were still watching. The whispers had evolved into questions, and the questions into research. A group of seniors, led by a soft-spoken girl named Sarah, the same one who had asked Hadley who Mabel was, had begun to dig. It started with a simple internet search, which yielded almost nothing. The staff directory had her listed as Horamel Jenkins, Facilities, and her official email had never once been used. There was no LinkedIn, no Facebook, no mention on the school's promotional materials. She had no academic articles attached to her name. It was as if her past had been swept clean, as spotless as the floors she tended. But Sarah had persistence and access to databases few students knew existed. With the help of Mr. Kaplan, the librarian, and one of the more quietly progressive members of the faculty, she gained access to a university archive from the 1970s. The interface was ancient, the documents blurry, but there it was. An abstract from a 1973 mathematics conference, authored by Mabel L. Jenkins and two professors from a southern university. The title was arcane, the language dense, but the meaning was unmistakable. She was doing advanced mathematical theory, Sarah said to her friends over lunch, holding the printed abstract like a sacred text. This isn't just college-level stuff, this is real, high-level research. They passed the paper around in reverent silence, each of them struck not only by the discovery itself, but by what it meant. Mabel Jenkins, the janitor they had overlooked for years, had once stood in rooms filled with scholars, discussing things they could barely pronounce. She had belonged to a world that had never been mentioned in calculus class, a world of complex proofs and theoretical landscapes. And now she walked these same hallways pushing a mop cart. Why would she stop? One of the boys asked, staring at the printout as if it might reveal more if he looked long enough. Sarah didn't have an answer, but she was determined to find one. The next day, she waited near the main hallway where Mabel usually passed through during third period. When the woman appeared, punctual as always, Sarah stepped forward, heart racing. "Miss Jenkins?" Mabel paused, one hand on the cart, the other holding a folded rag. Her eyes lifted slowly, landing on Sarah's face with a calm that made the girl feel instantly small. "Yes, child?" Mabel's voice was warm, quiet, patient. I just wanted to say, I saw what you did in Mr. Hadley's class." Mabel gave no response. She only waited. "And I read your paper. Sarah continued, lifting the folded printout from her backpack with both hands. The one from the conference. I didn't understand most of it, but it was brilliant. I just wanted to say thank you. Mabel looked at the paper. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she gave the faintest of smiles, more in her eyes than on her lips. "You're welcome," she said. "Now get to class or you'll be late." Sarah nodded, flustered, and turned to leave. As she walked away, she could feel the gravity of that brief encounter settle over her like dust. Mabel hadn't told her anything, but she had confirmed everything. By the end of the week, the story had spread through all corners of the school. Students talked about her in hushed tones. They no longer said the janitor. They said Miss Jenkins, with a carefulness that bordered on reverence. Rumors blossomed like wildflowers. She'd taught at MIT. She'd worked with NASA. She'd been a secret government mathematician. Most of it was nonsense, but the core truth remained unshakable. She had been someone extraordinary. Not everyone was pleased by this shift. In the faculty lounge, the atmosphere had grown colder. Hadley, in particular, had grown increasingly withdrawn. He spoke less during department meetings, arrived later to class, and had taken to erasing the board as soon as students left the room, as if trying to scrub away the memory that still lingered on its surface. Some of his colleagues pretended not to notice. Others whispered. "She embarrassed him," one teacher said to another as they poured coffee from the communal pot, "right in front of the kids." Well, maybe he deserved it. She's just a janitor. Was, maybe not always. They didn't say her name. Even among adults, the weight of what had happened was difficult to name. To some, it felt like justice. To others, it was a threat. The idea that someone so completely dismissed could possess such intellect challenged their very notions of merit, of status, of identity. For Mabel, it was nothing new. She had lived her life beneath assumptions. As a child, she had been the smartest in her class, skipped 2 grades, wrote proofs in the margins of her notebooks when the other students were learning multiplication tables. Her teachers had praised her brilliance, but only up to a point. As she entered college, things changed. The compliments grew less enthusiastic. The support waned. Professors questioned her work more aggressively than they did her white peers. Opportunities that seemed promised to others always slipped through her hands, like chalk dust falling to the floor. She had finished her master's degree, nearly completed her doctorate. But then her mother fell ill. The university offered no flexibility. Her advisor hinted that maybe someone like you should focus on more practical goals. She dropped out, took a job to pay for her mother's care, then another, and another. Doors kept closing. Time passed. When she arrived at Jefferson Prep, it was supposed to be temporary, but temporary became permanent, and she learned to endure, to work with dignity, to protect the ember of her knowledge in silence, rather than allow it to be extinguished by the world's indifference. She had not expected to write equations again, but when she stood before that board and the laughter swelled behind her, something inside her stood taller. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about remembering that she had never been wrong about herself. Now the school whispered her name like a riddle. The students watched her like a myth come to life. And Hadley? Hadley avoided her entirely. He took alternate routes through the halls. He left classrooms through side doors. He never mentioned the event, not even to his closest colleagues. One afternoon, as she was wiping the last of a scuffed footprint from the tiles outside the library, Mabel paused. Her hand lingered over the damp cloth. The air was cool. A group of students walked past, laughing softly, but they nodded to her. One of them, tall, freckled, usually silent, said, "Thank you, Miss Jenkins." She nodded in return. No more words were needed. That evening, in her small apartment, lit by the amber glow of a table lamp, she opened a box she hadn't touched in years. Inside were faded notebooks, old journals, handwritten proofs in the margins of grocery lists, a copy of her master's thesis with a coffee stain on the cover. She ran her fingers over the pages like one might touch the keys of a forgotten piano. She did not weep. She did not mourn. She simply turned to a blank page and began to write again. Not because she wanted to be seen, but because something in her had been reawakened, something long buried beneath decades of dust and silence. At Jefferson Prep, the board was clean again. The lights buzzed overhead. The students filled their desks, but something had changed, and no one, not even Mr. Hadley, could pretend otherwise. Richard Hadley sat at his desk, long after his last class had ended, staring blankly at the clean blackboard. The light in the room was dim, the sun outside dipping low behind the skeletal trees, casting stripes of orange across the floor. In his hand, he held a piece of chalk that he hadn't lifted once in the past 30 minutes. His fingers twitched against it, knuckles white, but he didn't write. He couldn't. The board had been cleaned earlier that day, not by Mabel, but by one of the student assistants, and yet, in his mind's eye, the solution still hovered there like a ghost, every symbol burned into memory. He could still see the curve of her letters, the graceful flow of each transition. The problem had been dismantled with such ease, such understated precision, that it mocked everything he thought he knew. He felt it again, that old, unwelcome tightening in his chest. It wasn't fear. Hadley didn't fear people. He feared irrelevance. In the days since that morning, his life had become a quiet descent into discomfort. He didn't sleep as soundly. His lectures no longer carried the same edge. He found himself doubting his own authority, something he'd once taken for granted, like gravity. He had spent his entire career building a fortress of intellect around himself, brick by brick. And, with a single act, a woman with a mop and a quiet face had cracked the foundation. He had misjudged her. That much was clear. But it wasn't just the mistake that plagued him. It was how easy it had been to make. She had always been there, year after year, hallway after hallway, and he had never once asked her name, never acknowledged her beyond the occasional complaint or sideways comment. She was invisible because he had wanted her to be. Because in the grand hierarchy of Hadley's worldview, janitors did not solve gauntlets. They did not think in terms of vector fields or infinite regressions. They cleaned up the aftermath of those who did. Now that certainty was gone. The whispers hadn't escaped his notice. Students were talking about her in the corridors, in the library, even in his own classroom before the bell rang. Some were still exaggerating, of course. One claimed she had worked with the Manhattan Project. Another swore she had been a secret advisor to the Department of Defense. But beneath the fables, there was a truth too undeniable to ignore. She had stood in front of his class and done something not one of his best students could. Not even he, if he was being honest, would have solved it that swiftly or elegantly. And that honesty, it was starting to creep into places he had long kept sealed. It had been years since Hadley had questioned his place in the world. He had made peace with the type of man he was, rigid, unapologetically critical, uninterested in comfort or compromise. He had told himself that excellence required detachment. But what if that detachment was a mask? What if it was just a way of insulating himself from seeing people fully, From seeing truth? He rose from his chair and paced to the window. The hallway below was mostly empty now. A few students lingered by their lockers. He spotted Mabel, barely more than a silhouette, as she turned the corner near the science wing. She moved with the same deliberate pace as always, the cart steady ahead of her, head held high. She hadn't once acknowledged the shift in attention she'd received, nor had she attempted to capitalize on it. No smugness, no speeches, just silence. There was a dignity in it that unsettled him more than any confrontation would have. Later that evening, Hadley found himself wandering the halls, unsure of what he was looking for. The school was quiet. Most of the faculty had gone home. The custodian lights had dimmed to half strength. He passed by Mabel's closet twice before he stopped. The door was slightly ajar, and from within came the faint scent of bleach and pine. He hesitated, then knocked once, softly. No answer. He pushed the door gently. Inside, Mabel was bent over a plastic bucket, rinsing out a mop with the same efficiency she applied to everything. She didn't look up. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Hadley said, his voice quieter than he expected. She straightened slowly and turned toward him, wiping her hands on a faded towel. Her expression was neutral, not cold, but unreadable. She waited. He didn't know how to begin. No lecture, no clever remark came to mind. His tongue, so often sharp and ready, felt thick in his mouth. "I came to say—" He paused. "I didn't know." A faint shift flickered in her eyes. A breath, that was all. "I didn't know who you were, what you were capable of." "I know," she said simply. That might have been the end of it. He could have nodded and left, but something held him there, something heavier than guilt, an urge to confront the hollowness in himself. "I've been teaching here for 15 years, he said, "and in all that time I believed I had nothing left to learn." She said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them like a bridge that refused to collapse. "I've prided myself on seeing talent, on recognizing brilliance. But I didn't see you. Not because you were hiding, but because I wasn't looking." Her gaze softened, just slightly. "You weren't meant to see me." He blinked. "What do you mean?" "I've been invisible a long time, Mr. Hadley. Not just here. Before this, too. There's a way people learn to walk through the world when the world doesn't think they belong in it. You keep your head down. You work hard. You make yourself small. Sometimes you forget how to be anything else." He leaned against the door frame, the weight of her words settling into him. "You used to teach?" he asked after a moment. "I used to learn," she said. "I loved the numbers, still do. But life had other plans." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't press. "I made you the punchline of a joke," he said, his voice low, "and you responded with the most gracious thing I've ever seen in a classroom." She turned back to the mop and began coiling the cord slowly. "You responded like a teacher," he added. She glanced over her shoulder, a flicker of something, amusement, maybe, passing across her face. "I responded like a woman who's tired of pretending," she said. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for me." He nodded. It wasn't the absolution he'd expected, but it was honest. More honest than most things he'd heard in years. "I'd like to make it right," he said after a pause. "I don't know how, but I want to try." "You don't need to do anything for me," she replied. "What you need to do is look, really look, at the ones you overlook. That'll be enough." He didn't argue. He couldn't. When he left the janitor's closet that night, he felt the hallways tilt slightly beneath his feet. The world hadn't changed, but something in him had. In the weeks that followed, he found himself listening more. When students spoke, he heard not just their answers but their hesitations, their doubts, the fear behind their questions. He began calling on students who rarely raised their hands. He offered feedback with care instead of derision. Some noticed, others simply assumed he was in a better mood. But he knew what had changed. Mabel continued her work with the same quiet rhythm. She greeted those who greeted her, offered a smile when one was offered first, but she did not chase attention. The students still whispered about her brilliance, but she never acknowledged it. When asked, she would only say, "It was just a problem. I happened to know the answer." But Hadley knew better. It hadn't just been a problem. It had been a mirror, and in that reflection he had seen both the limits of his own mind and the vastness of hers. Mabel had reminded him of something he had long forgotten, that the truest form of brilliance is not the need to be seen, but the ability to see. He began leaving the board half erased after lectures, inviting his students to add to it. He stopped using the term gauntlet. He no longer measured his success by how many students failed to keep up with him. He began wondering what it would mean to walk beside them instead. And always, in the corner of his vision, he saw her, moving quietly, steadily, without apology. Not a lesson, not a symbol, a person. He finally saw her. And that, perhaps, was the beginning of his own education. The winter deepened around Jefferson Preparatory Academy, casting long shadows across the grounds and painting the mornings in frost. The usual rhythms of the school year continued. Exams were prepared, midterm grades posted, and rehearsals for the spring musical began echoing faintly through the West Wing. But, beneath the routine, something subtler had shifted, like a current beneath a frozen lake. The incident in Mr. Hadley's classroom no longer buzzed through the corridors with the same urgency, but its effects lingered, quiet and enduring. There was a stillness in the way students looked at one another now, a consideration, as though something in their eyes had been trained to look beyond the surface. Mabel Jenkins continued her work, as she always had. Her steps were steady, her presence calm. If she noticed the occasional glances or the respectful nods from students who would once have ignored her completely, she didn't let on. She moved through the hallways with her cart and bucket like a figure from another time, untouched by the shifting tides of curiosity or admiration. The same rhythm of care remained in her hands, whether she was scrubbing a spill outside the cafeteria or quietly closing a window someone had left ajar. She worked with the quiet focus of someone who had long ago stopped asking to be seen. But there was something different now, something intangible in the way others moved around her. Teachers spoke with a little more warmth when they crossed her path. Students paused to hold doors, to offer smiles, to say her name with a new kind of reverence. She returned their gestures with the same grace as always, but her eyes lingered longer now. She had seen them change, however subtly, and part of her wondered how long it would last. One afternoon, as she was polishing the brass doorknob to the faculty lounge, a voice called her name. It was Mr. Davis, the principal. He was a broad-shouldered man with a clipped mustache and the posture of someone who had spent years trying to prove that dignity was not incompatible with discipline. He had always treated her with professional courtesy, but rarely anything beyond that. This time, however, his voice was softer. "Miss Jenkins, could I have a word, please?" She nodded, setting the polishing cloth aside. He led her into his office, a warm space with bookshelves that held more decoration than literature, and a large mahogany desk that seemed to loom no matter where one sat. He gestured for her to take a seat across from him, and she did, folding her hands quietly in her lap. "I'll get straight to the point," he said, settling into his chair. "I've been hearing a great deal about what happened in Mr. Hadley's class." She said nothing. She knew what was coming. Eventually, they always tried to make it into something, either a lesson, a story, or a spectacle. It's not every day a moment like that happens in a classroom," he continued, "and it's had an impact, a real one. The students are talking, the faculty are thinking. Some of the board members have even heard about it." Her expression didn't change. She waited. "I want to offer you something," he said at last. "We have an opening in the math department. It's not a full-time position, just a few hours a week, running an after-school enrichment program for students interested in advanced problem-solving. It wouldn't interfere with your current role unless you wanted it to, but it's a chance to teach again." She looked at him long and level. He wasn't patronizing her, that much she could tell. His tone lacked the usual lilt of white-gloved charity. There was sincerity in his voice, even a trace of humility. Perhaps the school was changing after all. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Davis," she said after a moment, "but I'm not looking to return to that world." "You could do both," he said gently. "You wouldn't have to give up your job." "It's not the work I've walked away from," she replied. "It's the way the work was valued, and who it was valued from." He nodded slowly. "I understand. Or at least I'm trying to." She leaned back slightly, her eyes settling on the bookshelf behind him. A row of framed photographs stood on one shelf, students shaking hands with visiting dignitaries, alumni posing in front of ivy-covered gates, all of them smiling, polished, safe. "I've spent years here," she said quietly, "and in all that time, not one person asked me where I'd come from. Not one person saw more than the mop in my hand." Davis shifted in his seat. "You're right," he said, "and I'm sorry." She looked back at him, her gaze not unkind. "Don't be sorry. Just don't pretend this moment makes me different than I was before. I've always been this person. You just started looking." There was a long pause between them, the kind that didn't need to be filled. He exhaled. "If you ever change your mind, the door's open." She nodded. "I know." He didn't press her further. She rose, thanked him politely, and left the office without another word. The next day, a few students approached her during her rounds. One of them, a wiry boy with glasses and a math club hoodie, held out a notebook shyly. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice cracking with nerves. "I'm working on a project for extra credit. Would you mind looking at it?" She took the notebook without hesitation, flipping through the pages with the same attention she had once given her own proofs. Her brow furrowed slightly as she scanned a section of equations. "You've skipped a constraint here," she said, pointing to the third page. "That's why your final value keeps drifting." He blinked. "Oh, that makes sense. I couldn't figure out why." She handed the notebook back. "You're thinking in the right direction. Just remember, elegance in math doesn't come from complexity. It comes from clarity." The boy beamed. "Thank you." Word spread quickly. By the end of the week, a small group of students had begun meeting informally in the library after school. They brought problems, projects, questions. She didn't advertise, didn't make announcements, but they came, one by one. She never turned them away. It was not a class. There were no grades, no tests, no attendance sheets, just young minds learning how to think without fear of judgment. And Mabel, seated at the end of a long table with a worn pencil and a quiet smile, was exactly where she needed to be. In the background, Mr. Hadley watched it all unfold with a growing sense of quiet admiration. He did not intrude. He did not speak of it during faculty meetings. But when he passed her in the hallway now, he nodded, not with guilt, but with respect. And sometimes she nodded back. Her legend continued to grow, but she never sought the spotlight. She remained in her uniform. She mopped the floors. She emptied the bins. She arrived early and left late. But within the quiet routines of her day, she was beginning to teach again. Not through lectures or chalk, but through presence. Through the example of her dignity. The school began to reflect this change in small, subtle ways. A new bulletin board went up in the hallway outside the math department with the title Hidden Figures of Mathematics. Her name wasn't on it, but one of the students pinned a quote attributed to EMJ that read, "Truth doesn't demand attention. It only requires recognition." No one took it down. One morning, as she was sweeping the floor near the front office, she noticed the cleaning supply closet had been reorganized. New bottles, fresh mops, and a note pinned to the wall that read, "For Miss Jenkins, thank you for teaching us all." She didn't ask who had done it. She didn't need to. What mattered was not the gesture itself, but the shift behind it. The school had begun to see her, not as a symbol, not as a miracle, but as a person. She had become the quiet pulse at the heart of Jefferson Prep, not because she had solved a single problem, but because she had revealed a truth that no one could unsee. Brilliance is not loud, it is not proud, it is not limited by status or age or skin. It is often hidden in the hands that clean the chalk off the board, in the voices that don't raise themselves, in the eyes that see everything and say nothing. And sometimes that brilliance chooses silence, not out of weakness, but because it has nothing left to prove. Mabel Jenkins had already proven everything she needed to, and in doing so, she had changed the school forever. Spring arrived at Jefferson Preparatory Academy not with sudden fanfare, but slowly, as if the earth itself were stretching after a long, heavy sleep. The trees on the campus lawn began to blush with pale green, and the air grew softer, no longer biting at the edges of students' coats and scarves. The school moved forward, as it always had, through its curriculum and rehearsals, exams and club meetings, the hum of institutional life continuing as though untouched by any single moment or person. And yet, something had shifted in the atmosphere, a subtle current, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, but undeniable to those who had been watching closely. Mabel Jenkins still walked the halls in her uniform. Her name was still stitched in the white thread on her left breast. Her cleaning cart still rolled quietly behind her, its familiar contents clinking and shuffling with each movement. But she was no longer invisible. The nods had become steadier now. They came not out of obligation or the residue of viral whispers, but from something deeper, recognition. Not of her as a symbol or an idea, but as a presence that had always been there, steadfast and clear, waiting for the rest of the school to open its eyes. The students no longer looked past her. They looked toward her. When she passed, conversations would pause, not out of discomfort, but as an instinctive gesture of respect. Some students called her Miss Jenkins now, even if she hadn't told them to. A few still struggled to find words when speaking to her, stumbling over their own nervousness, as if trying to reconcile the woman with the mop and the mind that had outpaced them all. She made no effort to correct them. She accepted their awkward greetings with the same quiet dignity she had always possessed. The informal gatherings in the library continued, growing in number. Every week, new students appeared with notebooks and pens, bringing their curiosity, their doubts, and their questions. Mabel never stood before a whiteboard. She never lectured. She simply sat with them, listened, asked questions that pulled answers from places they hadn't thought to look. Her presence became its own kind of instruction, a subtle lesson in patience, humility, and the discipline of thought. Teachers began to take notice. Some wandered into the library and lingered longer than necessary, pretending to browse nearby shelves while keeping one ear on the quiet discussions unfolding at the central table. Others, more candid, began asking students what they were working on and received answers that revealed depth and rigor far beyond the assigned curriculum. It wasn't long before whispers of Jenkins' Circle, as some students had begun to call it, found their way into staff meetings and parent-teacher conferences. Even Principal Davis, initially uncertain about how to handle the quiet phenomenon, found himself referring to Mabel's influence in conversations with the board. He never stated it outright, but the shift in tone during meetings, more attention to inclusivity, more questions about underutilized talent on campus, was unmistakable. There was a recognition spreading, like roots growing beneath the surface. It hadn't been forced or orchestrated. It had bloomed in its own time under the surface of tradition until the soil itself could no longer ignore what it held. One morning, as Mabel was dusting the shelves near the main entrance, she heard her name spoken over the intercom for the first time in the school's history. "Miss Mabel Jenkins, please come to the principal's office when you have a moment." She set down her rag, wiped her hands on her apron, and made her way to the office with her usual pace. Mr. Davis met her at the door, holding a folder in one hand and a peculiar expression on his face, a mix of apprehension and hope. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. She entered, sat down across from his desk as she had done once before, and waited. "There's an event being organized by the district," he began. "It's a new initiative. They want to highlight real stories of perseverance and resilience, people who have made a difference outside the usual molds. They're calling it Voices of Purpose. Each school nominates someone to speak at the event, a sort of keynote, I suppose." He paused, giving her a moment to react. She didn't. "I've recommended you." Still, she said nothing, though her eyes narrowed slightly in consideration. "I know you didn't ask for this," he continued, "and I won't force it, but I think your story, your presence, means more than you know. To the students, to the staff, to the larger community." Mabel looked at him for a long time, not with suspicion, but with the wary patience of someone who had spent a lifetime watching offers become traps. "I don't want to be a symbol," she said, her voice even. "I don't want to be someone's lesson." "I understand," Davis said. "But I think what you did, what you continue to do, is more than that. You've shown them what dignity looks like, what brilliance looks like when it doesn't ask for applause." She leaned back, her eyes drifting to the window behind his desk. Outside, students walked across the quad, their backpacks heavy, their laughter rising in the clean spring air. "Let me think about it," she said. "Of course," he replied, and meant it. She did think about it. Not just that night, but for many nights after. She thought about all the years she had worked in silence, about the times her voice had gone unheard, her mind dismissed. She thought about the moments of stillness that had sustained her, the small victories, the pride she'd held quietly inside. And she thought about the students now coming to her, not for answers, but for guidance. She thought about how they listened, and so, a week later, she said yes. The day of the event arrived with overcast skies and the promise of rain. The auditorium was filled with rows of chairs, most occupied by students from across the district, their parents, and faculty members. A few reporters milled about, adjusting microphones and snapping photographs. The stage was simple: a podium, a microphone, a banner behind it that read, "Voices of Purpose, Stories that Shape Us." Mabel waited backstage, dressed not in her uniform but in a modest gray dress and a pair of sensible black shoes. Her hands were folded in her lap. She had brought no notes. When her name was announced, there was polite applause, respectful, tentative. She stepped onto the stage and approached the podium with the same deliberate composure she brought to every task. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but firm, the kind that made people lean in, not out of strain, but reverence. "I'm not a genius," she began. "I'm not a miracle. I'm a woman who loved numbers and spent most of her life being told that wasn't enough." She paused. The room was silent. "I was once on a path that many would call promising. I studied math not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because it made sense to me. It brought order to a world that often felt chaotic. But the world didn't always welcome me. I was told, sometimes with words, sometimes with silence, that I didn't belong, that I was out of place, that I should lower my eyes and accept the floor beneath my feet." She looked out over the audience. "So I did, for a time." Another pause. "But I never stopped being who I was. I carried that part of me quietly. And one day, someone tried to make a joke out of me. And I decided to remind myself, and everyone else, what I still carried." Her eyes swept the room. "You don't need permission to be who you are. You don't need applause to be excellent. And you don't need a title to teach someone how to see the world differently." She stepped back. The applause came slowly at first, then built not into a roar, but into something steady, earnest, and full. She bowed her head, then walked off stage without looking back. Later that day, as the students filed into the cafeteria, one boy turned to his friend and asked, "Do you think she'll teach again, like full-time?" His friend shrugged. "I think she's already teaching." Back at the school, Mabel returned to her uniform without hesitation. She resumed her rounds, wiped windows, straightened chairs, replaced paper towels in the bathrooms. But the air around her had changed. She no longer walked in the shadows of the building. She walked through it, within it, as someone fully present, fully seen. She didn't need the world to remember her name. She only needed them to remember how to look. And they would. They already did. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.